Well, fuck. Hello, interwebs! I'm here to review the Season 1 finale of The House of the Dragon, this one titled The Black Queen. Alright, so many things to say, everybody. I have had a lot of thoughts about this season of television. I've done a whole video essay on my main channel about this show. I've done reviews of every episode, even discourse videos beyond that, because this has been a show that I've just had so many things to say about, and I think, whether I've liked stuff or hated stuff, found stuff problematic, found stuff absolutely amazing, and I found both in this show. I have always found so much discourse and discussion to be had because the series just has so much meat on its bones. And this finale, I think, is a great amalgamation of all of that because there's just so much to discuss with this finale. I think it was honestly a truly fantastic finale, but one that I have a lot of thoughts about in both a critical sense and just a praising sense. And on top of all of that, I will just say this is just a weird, nerdy geek. This episode, in its final 15 minutes, delivered on a sequence from the books that as soon as I read it in the books, I'm like, oh, I cannot wait to see them put this to screen. And quite frankly, they really delivered. The build-up in those final 10 minutes, and we'll talk about it more specifically in just a little bit, was just so good. It was so good. I was so pleased, and it even made some intriguing changes from the book in terms of characterization that I'm actually very excited to talk with all of you about because I'm of two minds about it, and I think it'll be an interesting sort of discussion to have in the comments once we get into it. So let us dive into this finale because there is a lot to talk about, and I am very pumped. So let's start off with our first scene where we have Rhaenyra talking to Luke, and I have to say I knew what was going to be coming this episode because I have read the book, so I knew that this scene between Rhaenyra and Luke was sort of to set up this like oh, they have a really loving relationship, and it's gonna make Rhaenyra really sad at the end because I know what's coming for this boy. So like I kind of knew that was the writer's intention going into the scene. But that being said, it was a really well written scene because it just sort of showcases the oppressive nature of expectation in this world where everyone is sort of expected to live up to a role. So you have Luke kind of expressing like, I don't want to rule Driftmark, and Rhaenyra is kind of doing the same thing to him that was done to her, that she's saying like, look, you have to live up to the expectations, you have to do, be this person that, our society and this sort of, legacy that behind us tells us to be. It's interesting how, like, she doesn't necessarily introspect on that, on like how the harm that it has done to her, that she is now kind of passing off to Luke. And it kind of creates this interesting meta commentary on the whole episode, because we know ultimately at the end of the episode that Luke dies. Spoiler, if you hadn't seen the episode yet, you shouldn't be watching this review. And so like he dies because of that sort of expectation that was placed upon Rhaenyra to be the queen, and then him having to go off and do these things for her. And so he dies because of that expectation and that legacy that was sort of that burden that was put onto Rhaenyra, and she's sort of doing the same thing to him, and he sort of pushes against it, and yet she's not fully introspecting on that here, and I thought that was an intriguing place to start off this episode. I also really liked that he called her perfect, and she's like, look, I am not perfect by any means, and it goes towards two things that I think were really interesting. It goes towards Luke sort of like establishing a bond with his mother so that his death later on really hurts Rhaenyra and hurts us as the audience, like we're being worried about him. So it sort of sets up like a nice, loving relationship between those two characters to make it more devastating down the line. But also it kind of points to like the fact that we've just discussing this whole season about like how womanhood is sort of placed upon this pedestal and like viewed as like this mysterious magical thing. There's this sort of mysticism placed upon womanhood that sort of like otherizes women and sort of places them in a hierarchy below men in a patriarchal society. We see this in our real world, and then this episode just like immediately frames that, like showing this this childbirth that the Rhaenyra has that is rough, brutal, and nasty and gross, which is where I was pulling that word from. And so it's just like this mysticism of femininity that young boys are taught in the world of Westeros and our world as well. That sort of is sort of indicative of a lot of the problems we see women having to face within this world. So I loved this setup scene. It did a lot of work in terms of the thematic and characterization needed going into this episode. But then we have everything getting set off with coming off of last episode, where we had Aegon being crowned king and sort of Rhaenys running off to Rhaenyra to warn her about what happened. One quick note to say here, this is about technically more about last episode than this episode, but I kind of wanted to bring it up. I do my reviews of my episodes before I watch the sort of end, like, writers discussion. Like, the end of every episode on HBO, they have, like, the last 5 minutes, which is, like, the writers talking about the episode and sort of the behind the scenes and everything. I don't watch those because I don't want those to color my impression of my review, but I watched them afterwards, and I watched the one afterwards last episode, and the writers just said, like, oh yeah, we wanted, like, this cool big epic finale for this episode, and we thought Rhaenys coming out of the floor would be cool, like, to just have her dragon just, like, shoot through the floor, and we thought that was a cool idea that we kept in, and I'm like, oh, so the whole, you wrote that because you just thought it was a cool moment, which it is, but you didn't really think of the implications on one, like, the townspeople of Westeros who would, like, be murdered in the thousands that we don't seem to give a crap about. And it's okay that the characters don't care about it, but the show should. That all those people were just murdered. And also you, like, kind of wrote yourself in a corner about why Rhaenys doesn't murder everyone in front of her who was her enemy at that point. And I'm like, oh, like, I liked that moment to a degree, but I was, like, threadbare on whether I liked Rhaenys' decision there. And now just knowing that the writers just wrote it because they thought it was cool, I'm like, oh, kind of makes that a little bit worse in my opinion. That's neither here nor there at this point. I'll let it go. It was a cool moment, but I can see the writers being like, oh, it was a cool moment versus actually thinking about what the implications for the character. That's neither here nor there. Let's focus on this episode. We have Rhaenys showing up and telling our characters what happened back in King's Landing, and it sort of sets off the chain of events of Rhaenyra sort of having to struggle with being crowned the queen and sort of having to set off this civil war. Obviously, this sort of this stress that is now put on Rhaenyra, learning that her father is dead, and I love Daemon also sort of seeing, like, Viserys having died, like, that hurts him as well. Matt Smith's acting in those moments without any words is fantastic, but it sort of sets Rhaenyra into premature childbirth, and all of that was just really hard to watch. I've struggled with this series in terms of how it has constantly depicted childbirth for women in the show, and I'm of two minds about it. The show constantly reinforces, like, women are used for just breeding grounds in this series, and that fits the world of Westeros, but I'm also, like, sometimes the exploitive nature of how they've depicted it in the show has sort of rubbed me the wrong way, because it sort of reinforces women's roles as not being on the battlefield sort of thing, and sort of feeds into some sort of framing that I think goes against some of the thematics of the show. But that being said, while I do have that sort of grander issue with the series that, like, again, it's one I'm of two minds upon, but this one in particular I thought was actually really good because it just shows Rhaenyra just struggling to be, like, just pissed off at this whole situation and the emotional and physical labor that she's going through, not just with her birth, but also of, like, this whole series of events that she just had to deal with, the fact that she's had to have this expectation placed upon her. I thought it was very well done, and the fact that Daemon is sort of making all these plans while the men in the room are hearing her struggling, and just the uncomfortable, like, how they're all uncomfortable with acknowledging it. I thought was just a really great sequence and great way to block all of that. And then Rhaenyra passing, giving birth to a baby that is dead was heartbreaking. Because you know that it probably came out of a lot of the stress of this entire situation. And then the fact that Rhaenyra, like, did all the stuff over the next few episodes just after having gone through that, like, god damn, girl. Oh, it's impressive. It's just damn impressive. So all of that was really excellent. Then we get this fantastic sequence where Otto Hightower shows up to deliver his terms of the Green, saying, like, look, we'll give you all your family places in court, like, you can do this respectably. And I love the blocking for the scene because it is very much meant to evoke the similar scene that we saw in episode 2 of this series, where young Rhaenyra sort of like did the same exact thing when Otto and Daemon faced off earlier. And so this is the same exact sort of setting. Otto and Daemon are facing off against each other on the same bridge years later, but now Rhaenyra flies in on her dragon, and instead of siding with Otto, she sides with Daemon. And I thought that was, like, oh, such a great, like, callback. And my favorite part of this entire scene was just the blocking of Rhaenyra coming in behind Otto Hightower's men, so her dragon's behind them. They know that they have no escape. She can murder them all if she wants to with her dragon. And then she just walks through them. They could kill her those knights could just kill her and slay her right there and be done with this whole thing. And yet she just walks through him, and it's like, it was such a power move that I'm like, mwah. And it was done without saying a word, without drawing too much attention to it. It was just a thing of blocking, and it was just so good. Whether that was a director's choice or whether that was in the script itself, whoever decided that was just brilliant. I loved that. And I loved seeing Daemon just being ready to, like, just murder people here, where Rhaenyra was sort of the voice of, like, look, we should stop and actually take this in. Because it showcases something that you're starting to see awaken in Daemon. There was that time jump that we had back in episode 5 that was like a 10 or so year time jump, and Daemon had, like, mellowed as a character. He was very much a hothead in the earlier parts of the series, then sort of mellowed. And now we're sort of seeing the mix of the two come forth here, where Daemon has sort of, like, he's mellowed as a person, but now, like, this, like, power is back within his grasp now that his brother is dead, and he can see, like, a way to the throne, and also there's violence in front of him that he can sort of enact to sort of get what he wants. You're starting to see that, like, that anger and like hot-headedness come back out of him, like being ready to fight, and everything. We'll talk more about that in a personal way in just a moment. So I liked seeing that sort of being drawn out of him. So I like those two sides of his character sort of now converging, which is an interesting way to have built that character. Moving on from that, though, I do love that Alicent's like letter, or like this sort of callback to their childhood that Rhaenyra gets, I think allows Alicent to be present in this episode, even though she's not physically present, and allows us to feel the emotional through line of those two characters that I liked seeing here, and that was what caused Rhaenyra to sort of like pause for a minute, her friendship with Alicent. Liked that, needed that, thought that was good, because I would have felt saddened if we didn't get any sort of acknowledgement of the importance of that relationship within this series, because it is less important in the book, if it existed at all, if I recall. And so the fact that they brought that forward here, I think, was an important thing, and it's what caused Rhaenyra to sort of say, like, look, maybe my job as queen is not to be queen, but to try to stop people from dying, because the whole of Westeros could burn if we have this civil war. So it's my duty to consider not doing it for the betterment of the people. And I'm just sitting here like, oh, Rhaenyra, the very fact that you're considering that is what makes you the good ruler over your cousin. So like it's this like, oh no, this is what makes you a good ruler. But I really found fascinating in this scene two things. One, Rhaenys, when Daemon sort of speaks up about the, like, you need to fight this, like, again, that hot-headedness coming out of his character, Rhaenys is just sort of sitting there smirking the entire time. She's just like, I'm just telling you, this is what dudes do. They like to be all sort of piss and vinegar. So she just sort of has that acknowledging stare. Also, I forgot to mention earlier, there's that scene where Rhaenyra is crowned the queen, and everyone kneels in front of her except for Rhaenys, and I'm like, Rhaenys, why are you not kneeling? It's like, is she old? It's like, I don't want to get on my knees. It's bad. I got a bad knee. I'm just like, Rhaenys. It actually felt like it would have been emotionally resonant if she had kneeled to Rhaenyra in that moment. So I'm wondering why they chose not to have her kneel in that scene. It was very strange. But anyways, I loved Rhaenys just sort of having that smirk on her face during here. But then this leads to Daemon coming up to Rhaenyra and starting to choke her. Because again, we see this hot-headedness and this desire and lust for power being drawn back out of him as a character again, now that it's back in front of him. And, it was rough to watch. Because despite the incest, which is always the qualifier that I have to put on that, despite the incest, I've actually kind of enjoyed their relationship. It actually seemed very supportive for the most part over the past few episodes. But then seeing, like, Daemon be abusive to her in this way, in the face of, like, the thing that he desires more than his caring for her, and that's his lust for power that's being pulled back out again. I think him being abusive, it fits his character that we had seen, again, sort of reconciling the two versions of the character over time that we've seen in the show. And it's interesting because there's been this, like, lusting for Daemon online in sort of the discussion on the show, and I've understood it too. He is easily the most fascinating character and one of the more emotional characters on the show, despite how little he shows, like the scene where he sort of helps Viserys up to his throne in episode 8. But I also feel like it makes me a little uncomfortable just because, like, Daemon is a terrible dude and has done some terrible things, like murdering his wife that we all seem to have forgotten about in some points in our discourse on him. So I as much as I don't like seeing a woman be abused, it reads as true for the character, and also one that I hope, like, allows us to be very much more critical of Daemon as a complex character. I don't want to, like, just throw him out as a villain, because I think that would be a diminishment to the discourse that you could have around him and sort of this sort of desire, lust for power that he embodies. And the sort of place and sort of pressure that it puts upon him as well. But also, I hope it allows us to like have that nuanced discourse about him as a character, because he's a very complex character, and one that I do not think we should just be lusting after completely, because he's definitely a fucked up dude at times, very much so. So all that was interesting. We also get stuff with Corlys and Rhaenys as well. Good to see Corlys back. I won't say too much about him, what I know from him in the book, but great character to track throughout the books, if you know, you know. And I like him sort of struggling with like, who do I side with? This is a very tough moment. Like, I could be the thing that swings this entire war for everybody, and him eventually deciding to side with Rhaenyra, sort of this idea for legacy and sort of that for his character, and Rhaenys being the one to pressure him into doing that, I thought was a great moment for her character as well. So those two were fascinating. This also leads us into the moment where Daemon goes down to see the dragons underneath Dragonstone. And I watched this episode with a friend, and she said, I'm not sure why that scene existed, because it felt like an unnecessary one. I think it does two things. One, it again highlights Daemon's isolation, as well as, again, his desire for power, because it just sort of shows like he is ready to fight and ready to like use his dragons to just wreck shop with everybody. But also, it allows us to see that Rhaenyra does have very powerful and nasty dragons. The reason that I think that is especially necessary to show that they do have really powerful dragons is because the ending sequence of this episode with Luke is going to undercut that, like, oh, the Greens have a huge dragon that can just murder everybody and just can easily kill like dragons like that. And so I think they need to at least showcase that there are dragons that Rhaenyra has that are much stronger than Luke's dragon that gets easily murdered at the end of the episode. So I think it was necessary to highlight that for us as the audience, that there are powerful dragons on Rhaenyra's side. A couple other things too is we do get Daemon sort of threatening those two King's Guardsmen with his dragon, which is that shot where his dragon comes up behind him. I was like, oh fuck! I was like, if I was those two, I'd be like, I swear to you, who am I? And then we also have Luke and Joffrey, Rhaenyra's sons, who it's interesting seeing Joffrey sort of push against Rhaenyra a little bit. Like, Joffrey sort of said, I'm going to go and do these things, and Rhaenyra's like, I'm the queen, you listen to me. And she's still understanding that he's her son, but she's sort of like having him sort of like, she has to like set lines like, I am the queen, you listen to me. And so it sort of goes to like the rebellious nature of kids at that time. And also, again, a little bit to the patriarchy. Is like her own son is somewhat rebellious of her being a woman who has power over him. And I'm sure that that'll be a gap that widens throughout the series with Joffrey's character. And sadly, Luke being like, I love you, Mom, I'll do anything for you. One other thing, too, is we also see the table that Stannis Baratheon would later use in Game of Thrones, that it was painted in sort of the table of Westeros that they used to make their plans for war on. And I love the way they filmed this, where it's like it lights up with like fire, like with heat, and it's sort of like this table is like heated up. I'm like, that's so cool. That's so much cooler than the painted table version that we saw in Game of Thrones. I'm like, why did Stannis have this thing painted? The glowy version of this table is so much better. It's so much cooler. I love that. It was a small little subtle thing, but I'm like, that table is bomb. Stannis, you're a boring man who ruins tables aesthetics and also just like everyone around you's lives. Anyways, that was beside the point. But anyways, this all leads us into the final sequence of the show that I was so, like I said, as a book reader, I was so excited to get to watch this, and they did not disappoint, because Luke going off to parlay with the Baratheons to try and get them onto Rhaenyra's side, you just felt the tension of that entire moment, and it was just all built brilliantly. Luke landing at the Baratheons' home, and you see how small his dragon is, and then you see Aemon's dragon. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but the huge dragon just lit up by the lightning from it. You just see how big it is, and I'm like, oh fuck, that dragon's huge. And then he goes in, and I love the way that the camera work is done in this scene where Luke goes in to talk to Baratheon, because you see Aemon off to the side, and you're like, oh shit. Some stuff's gonna go down. You see this tension between like Luke constantly looking at Aemon, and the camera going from Baratheon to like just turning to see Aemon, and just the camera just constantly reminding you that Aemon's just right off to the side, and just drawing your attention to like him just being there, and that growing tension with just him being in the room when they did not expect him to be. I thought was just so good. So just building that tension, Baratheon being hostile. It's like, oh, Aemon came with an actual offer. Did you? And Luke's like, no, I really can't. And he's like, well, fuck you. I'm not here to just sort of like give my allegiance to anybody. And so I thought that was all really, really, really great. And another interesting thing, too, with this sequence is it was also fascinating to see Aemon appear in this scene because we have just been following Rhaenyra this episode. It was interesting to just follow Alicent last episode and then just Rhaenyra this episode, at least the greens and the blacks, their sides per episode. Because like it frames Aemon as like just an antagonistic force, where very much last episode we were, he's not a good guy by any means, but we were kind of with him in that, like, emotionally, and here he's just a distance antagonist. And so I really like how the series manages to walk this line of like distancing us and then also bringing us into characters at the same time. So a character that we spent time with last episode, who is like seen as like a character we can emotionally track, is in this episode just seen as an antagonist. It's a very fine line to walk for a series, to just have us feel for a character in one episode and then frame him as like the antagonist in another episode. And I think it just goes to the really brilliant choice of just following Rhaenyra this episode, just following Alicent's side last episode. And I think that worked. But then this leads to Aemon sort of like revealing his eye and demanding Luke give him his eye in recompense for his own, and that sort of tension being built. And then Luke just sort of running away. It's like, all right, come with me, we're gonna go, and just flying away. And oh, Aemon's right behind him. Aemon's right behind him, and the dragon being over his head in that shot. I'm like, oh, and just Aemon teasing him and going after him was just such an excellent sequence. And I like the tension that they build in this scene, because you think for a moment that Luke has gotten away when his dragon sort of goes in that crevice. And I'm like, and then eventually kind of escapes into the air with a peaceful moment. And you're like, oh, like there's this moment, even I watching him being like, oh, is he actually going to get away? Even though I know what happens in the book. And so I loved those subtle moments where they're able to build tension within this scene between, and like actually give credence to why the smaller dragon might actually survive, because otherwise there was no way it was going to. So I actually really like those moments. And here's where they made some interesting changes to the book that I think are actually really intriguing changes from the book's version of events. In the book, which is told from a sort of distance historian's perspective instead of with the characters, but the impression you get from the book is that Aemon, when he goes after Luke, is just intending to kill him right off the bat. Like, he is just like, I'm going to murder my brother. You're just going to kill him right there. And there's no sort of nuance. He just used the eye thing as like a pretense, but he just really just wanted to murder his brother. Here in the show's version, they add two things. One is Aemon is made much more sympathetic in the sense that he really, the way he's played is he really just wants his eye from his brother. He wants revenge, but he doesn't want his brother dead. And you can see that at the end when his dragon kills his brother so casually, by the way. Like, the fact that the dragon just comes up and it's just done. There's no, like, big moment made of it. It's just like, yeah, dead. Just underscoring how big his dragon is and how little, like, Luke had no chance in a fight against this thing. Which I loved. I thought that was a brilliant way to film that. But you see Aemon being really upset that his brother died in that moment. Or his, cousin, not brother. His cousin died in that moment. And it just it allows Aemon to be a little bit more sympathetic than in the book, where he is just a bloodthirsty asshole. And so it was an interesting and intriguing change, because you see that he wanted revenge, but he didn't want his cousin dead. And I think that that's a change that adds a lot more nuance to his character, that sort of puts him in mirror to Daemon. Those, again, I would really track Aemon and Daemon as, if you have not read the book, I won't spoil anything for you, but like, seriously, track Daemon and Aemon as characters, because they really do parallel each other emotionally, in terms of like being men who are second brothers to kings, who feel like they should have all this power and yet don't. And yet are kind of the more deserving like person at certain points, and just have this sort of like this sense of emasculization to their lives that they constantly feel in comparison to their siblings and the world around them. And so I think there's an interesting parallel being drawn between those two characters. And you see it in this moment where Aemon kills Luke. And so I love that change. The other intriguing change is that both dragons, Luke's dragon and Aemon's dragon, disobey them to have this whole sequence happen. So it removes agency from those two characters, but I think it also highlights how dangerous these dragons are. Something that we didn't really get a sense of in Game of Thrones is that these are dragons that they do listen to the Targaryens, but they are to a degree like incredibly powerful beasts. And you got a little bit of that in I think like season 5 or 6 with Daenerys, but for the most part the dragons were fairly like listened to her. And so here I just like that, like, oh no, if you don't control these things, they will just go wild and do horrible things, and even the Targaryens holding them is very tenuous. So I actually really liked that change from the book. So, you know, it was one that I was like intrigued by. I was like, oh, this is a clear change in motivation from Aemon's character and also the dragons from the book. But I do actually really like it. I think it adds a lot more nuance to these situations. So that was great. But then it all leads to the end shot where Rhaenyra learns of this news. She turns around and she is pissed and ready to go. And it's like, woof, well, that's a place to start off or to end season 1 and going into season 2. So yeah, that's my sort of thoughts on this season of, or the finale of House of the Dragon. I thought it was really, really good. Like I said, I have had thoughts about this season overall, and I do think that there are some moments where they lack nuance, such as when Rhaenys sort of burst through the floor, killing a bunch of people just because it was a cool moment, as well as like some of the depiction of women throughout the series that I have. I'm not saying one it's bad or good. I just like I have complex feelings upon it by how they've constantly reinforced women and childbirth as a concept in the show and how they've chosen to depict it. Again, I'm not coming down one way or the other. I just have mixed thoughts on it. But ultimately, no matter what, this show has been great fodder for discussion. And so I've really enjoyed this season. You know, even when I've hated it. This is why I like doing reviews like this, because I enjoy talking about shows with a lot of nuance in this way. Like even when I dislike something or find something that not to my taste, I like when I can talk about it and like have a discourse about it. So yeah, House of the Dragon season 1 it is over. I am very like excitedly waiting for season 2 and upset that we have to wait a year and a half for it. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you all, my friends, live long and prosper.